Imagine joining the Roman army with nothing but a shield, a sword, and a promise. You are young.
Move those supply
You are
crates to
unknown.
the third line now!
And at the bottom of the military machine, nobody cares who you are. You march. You dig. You build roads. You carry your own equipment. And you obey. But if you survive long enough, something changes. The same soldier who once carried a shovel can eventually command hundreds of men. A common soldier can become a centurion. A centurion can rise to the highest position available to a career soldier. And above them stand men whose decisions can move entire legions, and sometimes change the history of Rome itself. So how did this brutal military hierarchy actually work? And what separated an ordinary Roman soldier from the men at the very top? Because in Rome, climbing the military ladder wasn't simply about gaining rank. It was about surviving long enough to earn it. Level 1, the miles. Every Roman military career began at the bottom. The miles was the ordinary legionary, the basic soldier who formed the foundation of the Roman war machine. He wasn't a senator. He wasn't an aristocrat. He wasn't a famous general. He was the man who actually had to carry the empire on his back. And that meant his life was brutally physical. Roman soldiers were expected to march long distances while carrying enormous amounts of equipment. Weapons. Armor. Tools. Food. Everything an army needed to survive. And after reaching camp, the work wasn't finished. The soldiers could be required to dig defensive ditches, construct fortifications, prepare roads, and establish the camp itself. The sword was only one part of the job. The Roman soldier was also a builder, a laborer, a guard, and eventually, a professional killer. Training was designed to turn individual men into a disciplined formation. The goal wasn't to create a group of heroes. It was to create a machine. Every soldier had to understand where to stand, when to advance, when to stop, when to hold the line. And when the formation came under pressure, individual panic could destroy everyone. That was why Roman discipline mattered so much. The strength of the legion wasn't simply that its soldiers were brave. It was that thousands of men could act together. But there was another price. A Roman soldier could spend decades in military service. And if he wanted to climb higher, survival was only the beginning. Because the next level came with responsibility. Level 2, the Tesserarius. Imagine being responsible for the army while almost everyone else is asleep. That was the world of the Tesserarius. The Tesserarius was associated with the guard and night watch system of the Roman camp. While soldiers rested, someone had to make sure the camp remained secure. Someone had to organize the watches. Someone had to make sure the sentries were awake. And someone had to make sure the right password was being used. The famous tessera, the watchword, helped identify friend from enemy. In hostile territory, this wasn't a meaningless piece of administration. It could mean life or death. Imagine a Roman camp surrounded by darkness. You can't see the enemy. You don't know where an attack might come from. And somewhere outside the walls, an enemy scout may be waiting for one mistake. One sleeping sentry. One forgotten password. One unguarded entrance. That's why the Tesserarius carried a different kind of responsibility. He wasn't simply fighting. He was protecting the entire military machine while everyone else slept. And this is where the Roman system becomes interesting. Because Rome didn't rely only on brave soldiers. It relied on people responsible for the thousands of small details that kept those soldiers alive. But the next level was even more dangerous. Because now, instead of simply protecting the army, you had to control it.
Ensure the night watch is relieved. Then inspect the third cohort. Right away, Centurion.
Level 3, the Optio. The Optio was the experienced right-hand man of the Centurion. This was no longer the ordinary soldier. The Optio had survived years of military service and earned greater responsibility. And with that responsibility came authority. The Optio had administrative duties. He could be involved in supplies, organization, records, and the practical running of the unit. But his most important role appeared when discipline broke down. On the battlefield, formations had to stay together. Because once soldiers started running independently, an organized army could become a crowd. And the enemy only needed a small gap. The Optio helped prevent that. He stood behind the formation and helped ensure that soldiers kept their positions. If someone tried to flee, the Optio was there to stop the collapse. This tells us something important about the Roman army. The Romans understood that courage alone wasn't enough. You needed a system that made retreat difficult. You needed officers who could force frightened men to remain soldiers. And above the Optio stood one of the most famous figures in Roman military history. The man who became the face of Roman discipline. The Centurion.
Hold the line!
Level 4, the Centurion. Forget the emperor for a moment. Forget the distant general looking at a map. On the battlefield, the man standing directly beside the soldiers could matter just as much. That man was the Centurion. The Centurion commanded a century, a tactical unit of soldiers, and was one of the most recognizable figures in the Roman military. His appearance alone was designed to make him visible. His distinctive helmet. His crest. His position at the front. Everything made him easier for his soldiers to find. Because imagine a battlefield without radios. No modern communication. No drones. No satellite maps. Just screaming men, dust, smoke, shields and weapons. If the soldiers couldn't see their commander, the formation could collapse. The Centurion therefore had to be where his men could see him. And that meant danger. A Centurion couldn't simply hide behind his soldiers. He had to lead. He had to maintain discipline. And when the line began to break, he had to hold it together. This is why centurions became such powerful figures inside the Roman army. They were not simply administrators. They were battlefield leaders. They were the men who translated orders into action. And their authority could be severe. Discipline was not optional. A Roman soldier who disobeyed could face punishment. And the centurion was one of the men responsible for enforcing that system. But there was something even more impressive. For a common soldier, becoming a centurion meant crossing a huge social barrier. You had started at the bottom. Now you were commanding other men. But there was still another level. Because among the centurions, one position stood above the rest. Level 5, the Primus Pilus. The Primus Pilus, the first file, represented the highest point a career soldier could realistically reach within the hierarchy described in your source. This was the senior centurion of the legion. And that made the position extraordinarily prestigious. The Primus Pilus wasn't simply another officer. He stood at the top of the experienced frontline soldier class. Think about the journey. A young man begins as an ordinary Miles. He marches. He fights. He survives. He gains responsibility. He becomes an Optio. Eventually, he may become a centurion. And after years of experience, extraordinary soldiers could reach the position of Primus Pilus. That journey could transform a man's social position. The Roman world was deeply hierarchical. Birth mattered. Family mattered. Wealth mattered. But the army could create opportunities that didn't exist elsewhere. Military success could bring money, status, connections, and a completely different future after service. The Primus Pilus therefore represented something powerful. A man who had started with a shield in the mud could rise into a position of enormous respect. But then the hierarchy changes. Because the next position isn't simply another step upward for the same kind of soldier. It belongs to a completely different world. Level 6, the Tribunus Laticlavius. Now we leave the world of career soldiers. We enter the world of Roman political power. The Tribunus Laticlavius, or broad-striped tribune, was an aristocratic military position. Unlike the veteran centurion who had spent years fighting and marching, this officer could come from an elite Roman family. He wore the broad purple stripe associated with high social status. And his position was connected not only to the army, but to politics. This is one of the most interesting contradictions in the Roman military system. The men who had spent years fighting could possess enormous practical experience. But above them could stand young aristocrats whose future depended partly on political advancement. Military service could therefore serve as preparation for a much larger career. And one famous Roman figure understood this extremely well. Julius Caesar. Before becoming one of the most famous political and military figures in history, Caesar gained military experience and learned from the army. He saw how soldiers behaved, how armies moved, how supply worked, how commanders gained loyalty, and how military success could create political power. That connection between the army and politics would eventually become one of the defining features of Roman history. Because in Rome, a successful general didn't simply return home with medals. He could return with an army that was loyal to him. And that could change everything. Which brings us to the final level. The man who could command an entire legion. Level 7, the Legatus Legionis. At the top of this military hierarchy stood the Legatus Legionis. This was no longer simply a battlefield position. It was a position of enormous political and military authority. A legatus could command an entire legion. Thousands of soldiers. Thousands of lives. And the responsibilities went far beyond simply ordering an attack. A commander had to understand strategy, logistics, diplomacy, politics, and the complicated relationships between Rome and the peoples living along its borders. The legatus could negotiate with foreign leaders, direct military operations, and exercise Roman authority across a territory. This is where the Roman military system became connected directly to the empire itself. A legion was not just an army. It was an instrument of Roman power. And the man commanding that legion could become extraordinarily influential. One famous example is Vespasian. Before becoming emperor, Vespasian built a reputation through military command. His career demonstrates something fundamental about Rome. Military success could become political power. Another example is Germanicus. After Rome suffered the catastrophic defeat in the Teutoburg forest, Germanicus led Roman forces back into German territory. The objective wasn't simply another battle. It was to restore Roman confidence and recover the honor lost when 3 legions had been destroyed. This shows the enormous responsibility carried by Rome's senior commanders. They weren't simply soldiers. They were political actors. They represented the empire itself. And sometimes, their decisions affected millions of people. The real secret of the Roman army. So what made this system so powerful? It wasn't one rank. It wasn't one weapon. It wasn't even one brilliant general. It was the chain. The miles followed the Optio. The Optio supported the Centurion. The Centurion maintained the formation. The Primus Pilus represented the highest experience of the career soldier. The Tribunus connected the army to Rome's political elite. And the Legatus turned thousands of soldiers into an instrument of imperial strategy. Every level had a purpose. And every level depended on the one below it. That is why Rome could repeatedly put armies into the field across enormous distances. The system was designed to function even when individual men died. A centurion could fall. An Optio could take control. A commander could disappear. Someone else could assume responsibility. The machine continued. And that may have been Rome's greatest military advantage. Not that Roman soldiers were invincible. They weren't. Rome lost battles. Rome lost armies. Rome suffered devastating defeats. But the Roman military system was incredibly difficult to break completely. Because it wasn't built around one hero. It was built around thousands of men performing specific roles. Final. A Roman soldier entered the army as an individual. But Rome tried to turn him into something else. A piece of a machine. A machine that could march for miles. Build its own camps. Hold its formation. Survive terrifying battles. And keep moving. From the ordinary miles. To the watchful Tesserarius. The enforcing Optio. The feared Centurion. The elite Primus Pilus. The aristocratic Tribunus Laticlavius. And finally the powerful Legatus Legionis. Every position represented another layer of Rome's military machine. And that's the real reason Rome conquered so much of the ancient world. Not because every Roman soldier was the greatest warrior alive. But because Rome learned how to turn ordinary human beings into an organized force capable of operating on an extraordinary scale. The empire wasn't built by emperors alone. It was built by the men standing beneath them. Men who marched. Men who dug. Men who fought. And men who survived long enough to climb the ladder. That was the Roman army. And that was the machine that built Rome.